So now that we got a working service, it's time to dive deeper into services and, most importantly, dependency injection. Because services in the end are about creating such classes which can have shared data or shared logic or both. That's basically it. The interesting part then instead is how you can make Angular aware of those injectable services. And one way of making Angular aware, and arguably the most important and common way, is to use this add injectable decorator with provided in set to root. But as it turns out, that's not the only way of providing an injectable value and of making Angular aware of it. Because you might recall that I mentioned these different injectors which are managed by Angular, and I mentioned that I would come back to them later. Well, now is later. The idea behind these injectors is that Angular has them to register values that can be requested by components, directives, or services. So it's these injectors to which these components, directives, and services reach out in the end if they need a value. And these injectors are also set up as a hierarchy with the platform injector at the top. Technically, there is a null injector above that, which always returns an error if you request a value from there. So it exists basically as a fallback to generate an error in case you're requesting a value that's not provided by any injector. But that's therefore not really an injector that provides a value. Instead, it will just generate errors if you are not providing a value. So these are instead the important injectors here. And the idea behind them is that the platform injector could provide values, service instances, for example, for multiple applications that are registered in one Angular project, which is a more advanced use case and which is not something we have in our demo application here. But in main.ts, you could bootstrap multiple applications, and it would then be the platform injector that could provide a single instance of a service, for example, for multiple independent applications. But more relevant for most Angular applications are the application root environment injector, potentially the module injector if you're working with ng modules, which is something I'll get back to later, and the element injector. And it's always the element injector to which a component reaches out first, for example, to request a dependency, a service instance, for example. And if it doesn't get one from there, it moves up to the application root environment injector or the module injector. And if it doesn't get a service instance from there, it moves up to the platform injector. And if it doesn't get one from there, it moves up to that null injector and gets an error. And you can see that error in action if you disable this injectable decorator here on this tasks service class. With that change made, and that's the only change I made here, you will see that now the application seems to crash. And if you open your developer tools, you'll see an error here from the null injector, which I mentioned, which in the end tells us that we requested an instance of the tasks service, but we got no provider for it. And that's the job of the null injector. It generates those errors in case we're requesting something which we're not providing anywhere. And we aren't providing this service anywhere because I removed this annotation. So how else could we provide it? Providing a service with help of add injectable and provided in set to root is the most common use case, and therefore that's how you typically want to provide your services. But there are alternative ways. With that disabled, you can, for example, provide that service to your entire application by going to the main.ts file and by then passing a second argument to bootstrap application. And that argument should be an object. And this object then has a providers property which you can set up. And this wants an array of providers, and a provider then in the end is a piece of information that lets Angular know that a certain value should be injectable. In its simplest form, you can pass the tasks service to this providers array now. Just like this, and Angular will do the rest. With that, you register this tasks service with the application root environment injector, just as you would do it with @injectable with provided in set to root. But now by using this configuration object on Bootstrap application. With that done, therefore, if you save that, you see the application seems to work again, the error is gone, and that all seems to work again. So that's one other way of providing a service. Now, one important difference compared to using @injectable with provided in set to root is that this approach, where you use this configuration object, does not allow for tree shaking of this tasks service thing. Which in the end means that Angular tries to optimize your code as much as possible once you prepare it for deployment. And during that optimization process, it tries to throw away any code that's not being used or that's at least not needed initially when the app starts. Now, when you register your injectable value, your tasks service, with this providers array here, and you therefore add this import here, it will always be included in that initial code bundle that is generated by Angular, because Angular sees that it's needed right from the start here, in this very first code that executes when the app starts. Now, if your app would be more complex, and this entire tasks feature would maybe only be loaded at a later point of time, the tasks service would be included in that initial bundle, even though it technically might not be needed initially. And I'll get back to lazy loading and splitting your code across multiple bundles to improve efficiency a little bit later. For now, it's just important to take away that with this approach here, this code that belongs to the task service will always be included. Whereas if you use @injectable with provided set to root, this is not necessarily the case, and therefore this approach with this decorator and this setting can lead to more optimized code bundles and to a smaller initial code base that's shipped to your users. That's why it's typically recommended to use this approach instead of using this providers array. That's why I will copy this code and then comment it out and remove this from here so that we still see it for reference, but the code isn't active anymore. Because this is an alternative, but that is typically the better way of providing that value if you want to provide it to the root application injector. Now, besides providing a service like this, or with help of this configuration object here, there also is another way of registering an injectable value with Angular. You can register it with the element injector instead of that root environment injector. And the element injector is a special kind of injector that's closely tied to your DOM elements, to your components and directives in the end. So if you want to inject a service into another service, which is something we'll do later, the element injector is not really an option because those other services aren't elements and therefore don't try to get values from that element injector. But for components and directives, the element injector is part of that injector tree Angular looks up. So, back in the code, if I comment out @injectable again, we could also provide that tasks service with help of the element injector to our tasks component and all related components, by going to the tasks component TS file, and then there we can add a providers array to that component decorator configuration object. And the idea behind this providers array here is that it allows you to set up values that should be injectable that are tied to the element injector that belongs to this component. Now, all child components, so all components and elements used in the template of the tasks component, will also have access to that element injector. But other components, like the app component, for example, wouldn't have access to it. So the service is then in the end restricted to that part of your component tree. And there also is another important difference to which I'll get back later. So we can also add our tasks service here to this providers array in the tasks component, so that all the task related components, so app new task and the tasks list, have access to that service. And they will have access to one and the same instance of that service. If we would provide the tasks service inside of the tasks list component, for example, it would get access to a different instance of the service than the new task component. But like this, it will work. If we save that, we therefore can again add our tasks, change the status, filter, and so on. That all still works. But that's how we can use the element injector. There is something important you must understand and know about that element injector though.